Norfolk, October 1825. It was the settled conviction of the whole of Fenbridge, a conviction the town had arrived at, as the most comfortable convictions always are, by looking at the front of a thing, and never once troubling to walk round to the back of it, that a bank was to be trusted in precise proportion to its marble. The little old Bank of Merrow's did its business, as it had done these 40 years, from behind a plain oak counter in a plain brick counting-house in the marketplace, over which the name had been painted so long that the weather had taken the shine off it, and the great new county bank floated that very autumn upon a handsome London prospectus, and a subscription the whole neighborhood had scrambled to join, did its business from behind a portico of new stone pillars so white and so tall that a farmer coming in to lodge his rent felt he had wandered by mistake into a place of worship, and lowered his voice accordingly. And the town, being human, drew the human conclusion, and carried its money across the square from the plain oak counter to the marble one, note by note and deposit by deposit, in the settled certainty that a house which could afford so many pillars must be very safe indeed. It is worth the setting down, because it is the whole of the story that follows, for a bank, like a reputation, is worth exactly what it can pay across the counter the day the whole town comes asking, and no marble upon the front of it can add a sovereign to that, nor any man's fine talk of credit take a sovereign away. On a bright October forenoon, at the grand opening of the county bank, the pillars new scrubbed, a cold collation laid out under them, the subscribers gathered to congratulate one another upon the fortune they were all about to make. Julian Denby, 4th Baron Harcombe, delivered the judgment that the county would be repeating, with steadily increasing enjoyment, and at his own expense, for the better part of 2 years. He was the bank's chief proprietor and the head of its board. The concern had been got up chiefly on the strength of his name and his acres, along with a great many opinions he had formed in town upon the science of credit and circulation, and the timid folly of keeping idle metal in a box. And open in his hand lay the elegant printed prospectus of the affair, drawn by a fashionable London projector, a Mr. Vane, who had never in his life stood behind a counter on a day of alarm, and who had demonstrated with beautiful figures that a bank which kept a great reserve of gold against its notes was throwing away the half of its profit, since the notes, once the public trusted them, would circulate forever and need never be paid at all. A young woman who had come across the square with her father, a banker's daughter, present on the family's business, and asked for her opinion by nobody, had just observed, in a level and unhurried voice, that the county bank had put out a great many more notes than it could ever answer in coin, if the town should once come asking for gold. The Baron did not look up from the prospectus. Gold in a drawer is idle money. "Keep to your needlework, Miss Merrow," he said to the manager at his elbow. And then, still without lifting his eyes, in the tone a man employs for a draught from an ill-fitting door, "And if Miss Merrow has views upon the theory of credit, Mr. Craik, she may retail them to the sewing circle. I am told that among the ladies of the neighborhood a timid opinion will always fetch its price in wool, provided it is offered often enough and overworked small enough to excuse it." Within the week, Miss Merrow had staked the old bank's life upon the very metal he had called idle. And by the spring after the winter that this history turns upon, this is the end of the story, and we shall come round to it in good order, but it is only fair that you should know the road the tale is travelling. The Baron of Harcombe, the most modern and least anxious man upon the whole county bench, would be standing bare-headed at that same plain oak counter, with his hat held against his breast, asking the terms of the young woman he had not troubled to look at, and the little bank he had offered that autumn to buy up and close, as a man buys a cottage to pull it down for the view, would be, by the common consent of the very county that had laughed at her hoarding all year, the one house between the coast and Norwich that had paid every note it ever issued in gold across the counter on the worst day the money of England had seen in a generation, and when his aunt asked him, with the family plainness, what in heaven's name he had meant that morning under the new pillars, his lordship would discover, to his considerable discomfort, that he could not for the life of him remember what he had meant by it at all. But that is a year and some months on. This is the October before, and we must begin where she began, which was, as it happened, standing in the cold of the strong room of Merrow's bank, with a candle and a folding brass balance, weighing the last of the new gold sovereigns one by one against the notes her house had out, an hour before the Baron pronounced her caution a thing for the sewing circle. Charlotte Merrow, Lottie to nobody, for she had never once invited it, Miss Merrow to the town, and the Merrow girl to such persons as felt her existence wanted a syllable of apology, was 27, the only surviving child of Josiah Merrow of Fenbridge, banker, sole proprietor of the little old bank that had answered the market town's plain needs for 40 years, and never yet failed a customer of a shilling. Her mother had been gone these 19 years. Her father, left with a grave, watchful daughter, who asked what things cost and remembered the answer, did the only sensible thing a busy man could, and put her to use. She had kept the books and weighed the gold across the counter since she was 18. Could tell you to the sovereign how many of the house's notes were abroad, and how much coin sat in the strong room to meet them, and had saved her father £400 at 23 by declining, alone against the whole board of his friends, to lend the bank's deposits long upon a canal that was never cut. She had, besides, a rule her father had taught her the way other fathers teach a catechism. A note is a promise, Charlotte, old Josiah liked to say, and the gold is the payment, and any man alive can print you a handsome promise. Never mind the front of the house, nor the fine talk of credit. Ask only what is in the till the morning the whole town comes to be paid. Weigh the coin, and never trust the face of it. It is necessary to say plainly, because the parlors of the town said it often and less kindly, what Charlotte Merrow was not. She was not a beauty, though a long way from plain. She had a clear, composed, attending face, and a way of looking at whoever was speaking, as though what they said might be weighed, presently, against the coin itself. She was not accomplished, and she was not married, a circumstance the town attributed to the ink on her fingers, and her unwomanly familiarity with a strong room, and her father to the poverty of the arithmetic that had so far presented itself. She had observed that a prosperous banker's only daughter drew a particular sort of suitor, had priced that sort accurately, weighed him, and found him light, and declined to change good coin for him. The Merrows had a plain interest in the new bank beyond the general interest of the town, and it was this. Old Josiah's sight and strength had both been failing these 2 years, so that the whole real conduct of the old bank, the discounting, the note issue, the keeping of the reserve, the daily judgment of whom to trust and for how much, had passed, quietly and without any deed being drawn to say so, into the hands of his daughter, who now sat in the inner counting-house and made every decision old Josiah was too tired to make, and let the town go on calling it his. And the decision she had made and held to, against the fashion of the age and the advice of every clever gentleman who dined at her father's table, was the one the county bank had that morning been floated expressly to mock. She kept the reserve full. For every note the old bank put out she kept, lying quiet in the strong room, very near its worth in gold, not the fashionable third, nor the daring quarter, but very near the whole, so that if every holder of a Merrow note in the 300s of Norfolk walked in together on one morning and laid his paper on the counter, he would walk out again with gold, and the doors need never shut. The town thought this the timidity of a woman who did not understand that money was made to work. It called her reserve idle metal, money asleep, a spinster's hoard in a box, and it carried its deposits across the square to the marble bank that would lend them out again the same afternoon at a profit. Charlotte let it go, and kept her gold, and weighed it. So when the great new bank was got up, and the whole neighborhood went subscribing, and the whisper ran that his lordship's grand concern would presently absorb the little old bank and put the Doughty Merrows out of a trade too large for them, Charlotte did the thing she always did before she would let a farthing of the town's trust ride upon anything. She sat down with the prospectus and read it, slowly with a pencil and from the back. She read, first, the thing the handsome document had been most carefully arranged never quite to say. The capital was subscribed, but not paid. The gentlemen had put down their names for great sums and their money for very little of it, so that the splendid figure at the head of the prospectus was a promise of gold, not gold. She read, second, that the county bank meant to do, on purpose and at large, precisely what her father had spent his life declining to do at all, to put out 3 notes, and 4, and in a good season 5, for every sovereign behind them, on the modern faith that a note once trusted need never be paid. And she read, third, what would happen to this glittering machine on the one morning its makers had written their whole scheme to assume could never come, the morning the town lost its nerve and came asking, all together, not for paper but for gold. There was the flaw, plain as a light guinea in a true balance. The county bank was built to prosper in every weather but the one that visits every bank at last, and had kept, against the day of asking, almost nothing to be asked for. She crossed the square to the opening, with her father on her arm, and her mind entirely made up, and she was in her place, a little below the great people and well within hearing, in good time to see the men transact. She heard Mr. Craik, the county bank's manager, a plausible, dry, prosperous man of 45, who had contrived to make himself the only person in the concern who understood exactly where its money went, read out the figures of the subscription in the round, confident voice of a man laying a foregone fortune before gentlemen too pleased to check it, and she watched the Baron of Harcombe, with the London prospectus open at his elbow, and his mind visibly 3 moves ahead upon some larger question of circulation and public credit, receive the congratulations of the room as though the profit were already banked. It was when Mr. Craik came to the flourish of the thing that the new bank would presently offer to take the old Merrow business off the town's hands and relieve the county of the last of its timid, old-fashioned, gold-hoarding houses, that Charlotte Merrow, who had not been going to speak, and who was never afterward able to decide whether it had been judgment or simple bookkeeping. The plain discomfort of watching a hollow thing valued as sound found that she had spoken. I would not put the town's money there upon those figures, my lord, she said. Or not all of it, and not while the reserve stands where the prospectus leaves it. Your capital is subscribed, but very little of it paid, so the great sum at the head of the paper is a promise and not a possession. Your notes are to be put out 3 and 4 to every sovereign you hold, on the faith that no one will ever ask for the gold at once, which holds until the day someone does. And your deposits are to be lent long, on land and canals and enclosures that cannot be turned back into coin in a week, if a week is all you have. That is a bank built for every season but the bad one, my lord. It will pay handsomely as long as no one is frightened. But a bank is not worth what it earns in the fair weather. It is worth what it can pay across the counter on the one morning the whole town comes asking for gold, and on that morning, by your own figures, this house will have almost nothing to pay with. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way a room goes quiet when something has happened outside the order of the day. Mr. Craik looked at his beautiful figures. Sir Gregory Pell, a florid neighboring baronet, with a laugh like a coach going over a cattle grid, and the better part of his rents already promised to the new subscription, looked at the ceiling, hugely diverted. Josiah Merrow looked at his own hands, because he knew his daughter, and knew that the only question now remaining was how dearly the next half-minute would be managed. And the Baron of Harcombe finished the sentence he was reading before he answered. This was noticed and repeated for months, and what he said to his manager, as though the place where Miss Merrow stood had been an empty one. The reader has heard it already. It was a word about idle money, and a word about her needlework, and a pleasantry about the price of a timid opinion among the sewing circle, and it was delivered without heat, without malice, and without one glance at the young woman who had just, in 6 plain sentences, described the precise manner of his ruin 14 months before it arrived, which was, in its way, the completest dismissal a man of his rank had to give, since even contempt is a kind of notice, and he had not paid her so much as that. Charlotte drew the line under the column. That is to say, she did with her face and her folded hands the thing she did at the foot of a day's accounts, ruling the matter off, neat and final, and carrying nothing of it forward that need not be carried. Nobody could ever afterwards say the composure had been anything but exact. Then the town is well advised, and I am answered, she said pleasantly, to nobody in particular. Papa, I think we have seen the pillars. Do not let me hurry you from the collation. The ham, I am told, is his lordship's own. They went home across the square. The old man and his daughter passed the plain oak counter with the weather-worn name, and Josiah Merrow, who had said nothing in the marble bank and would say a good deal at his own fireside, observed to her only, on the step, that she had made an enemy of the richest man in the county in the time it took to state a balance. I have made no enemy, Papa, said Charlotte, drawing off her gloves. I have stated a fact, and he has declined to hear it. Those are different things, and the difference is his, not mine. A fact is very patient. It will keep until he wants it. And she went into the counting-house and lit her candle and went down to the strong room to finish weighing the gold. The offer came within the week, as offers do when a great concern has decided a small one is in its way, and it came by the hand of Mr. Craik, who brought it to the plain counting-house with the particular civility of a man doing a kindness he expects to be thanked for. The county bank would buy the goodwill and the notes of the old Bank of Merrow's at a fair valuation, retire the tired old name, pension the old gentleman handsomely, and relieve his daughter of a charge that Mr. Craik was sure she would be the first to feel, had grown too weighty for a lady to carry alone. He laid it before her as one lays a rescue before a person too proud to ask for one. Charlotte heard him out to the last comfortable word, and weighed the offer as she weighed everything, and declined it. You are very good, Mr. Craik, she said, and I will give you a plain answer, that you may carry it back entire, and save yourself a second journey. I will not sell you the notes of this house, because I mean to go on paying them, which is a thing I can do, and you, I think, presently cannot. And I will not retire the name, because the name is the whole of the property. 40 years of paying on demand is not a thing a bank can buy of another bank. It can only be done, morning by morning, or lost in one. You have offered to relieve me of my reserve, as one might offer to relieve a traveler of a heavy coat on a warm afternoon. I have known the afternoons to turn, Mr. Craik. I shall keep my coat. And she showed him out with a courtesy so exact that he was halfway across the square before he understood that he had been refused, and refused with a completeness that left nothing to negotiate. Then she did the thing that made the county certain she had lost her wits along with her temper. She had a plain notice printed, no marble upon it, only the weather-worn name, and 6 lines of honest type, and set in the window of the old bank, and sent about the market towns, that the old Bank of Merrow's would, as it always had and now said so in print, pay every note of its issue in gold coin across its counter, on demand, to any holder, on any day it was open, and ask no man to take its paper a yard further than he chose to carry it. It was, the town agreed, a very quaint and touching advertisement, and precisely the sort of nervous flag a failing little house would think to wave. The marble bank did not trouble to answer it, being far too solid to discuss the question of whether it could pay, and the notice was read chiefly for the entertainment of it. What the town did not see, because it looked like a woman fussing over her hoard, was that Charlotte had spent the same week making the notice true past any doubt, calling in quietly what short loans of the banks were out and could be got, declining new ones that could not be turned back to coin in a fortnight, and laying by gold, good full-weight new sovereigns, weighed one by one on the folding balance, and told into the strong room, until the reserve stood not near the whole of the note issue, but past it, so that the promise in the window was not a hope but an inventory. And she went, before the ink of the notice was dry, to Mr. Ferris. Mr. Ferris, attorney of Fenbridge, had done the Merrows' business for 20 years, and had long since given up being surprised by either of them. But when Miss Merrow, coming in with a fair copy of her notice, and a perfectly serene countenance, instructed him not only to see the pay in gold undertaking properly drawn and witnessed, but to go quietly about the county in the coming months and buy up, at whatever discount their uneasy holders would take, as many of the county bank's own notes as he could lay hands on, he permitted himself to set down his pen. The county notes, Miss Merrow, his lordship's own paper. That the whole town holds as good as the Bank of England's. The whole town holds my reserve to be idle money too, Mr. Ferris, and I have just staked the house upon it. The county's notes are good as gold this morning, and will pass at their full face for a while yet. But there will come a season. I do not know the month, but I know the arithmetic, and the arithmetic is not in doubt, when a man holding one of them will be glad to give me 19 shillings of it for 18 of mine, to have gold in his hand and not a promise in his pocket. When that day comes, I mean to be buying, not selling. I should like to hold his paper when the reckoning is read, and I should like, when the day arrives that somebody troubles to weigh that grand bank's reserve against its issue, to have every right in law to be in the room and to be paid. She drew off her gloves and sat, the undertaking drawn tight, the county notes bought as cheap as fright will sell them, and no noise about either. I do not want a cleverness talked of. I want a bank that pays, and the standing to prove it, before his lordship's manager has finished counting what my one dull notice in a window is going to cost him. The county did laugh. It is only fair to the county to say that the joke, as first received, was a good one. The Merrow girl, the ledger-keeping one, with the ink on her fingers and the strong-room key at her waist, had been set down by the Baron at the opening, before the whole neighborhood and over the very ham he had provided, and had thereupon, in what the parlors agreed could only be a fit of wounded female temper, refused a handsome offer for a tired little business, nailed a nervous notice in her window promising gold to anybody who doubted her, and buried the family fortune deeper than ever in a hoard of coin that could not earn a penny, while the whole rest of the county grew rich on the new bank's easy paper, all to spite a lord who had already forgotten her name. Sir Gregory Pell told it at 11 dinners in a fortnight, and it grew in the telling. By the 10th, Charlotte had gone down on her knees in the strong room to her idle gold like a miser in a play. But Lady Adela Denby, the Baron's own aunt, a sharp, upright, indestructible old widow of near 70, who had watched, from a great height and with a cold eye, a good many fine-sounding schemes go the way of all paper, heard the story twice, and delivered, over her nephew's own table, the first dissenting verdict in the county. Wept? That young woman would no more weep behind a counter than she would give short change for the pleasure of it. Depend upon it, Marcus, she has weighed your grand bank, and you have not. Girls of that sort do not bury money to spite a lord. They bury it because they have read the arithmetic and mean to be the last house standing. And she moved the whole of her own considerable fortune out of her nephew's marble bank across the square to the little oak counter that had promised, in plain print, to pay her in gold whenever she asked, to the visible discomfort of Mr. Craik, who could not for the life of him refuse a lady her own money, and could very ill spare the coin it took to hand it to her. You keep a curiosity shop of coin, aunt, and my funds come back to me from the marble side, in a comfortable stream regardless, said the Baron, not much troubled. But Lydia Della only cracked a walnut and let the matter stand, and was proved right in the fullness of time so completely that she was never, to her lasting satisfaction, allowed to forget that she had said so first. The year that followed was the county bank's great year, and it was, for exactly that reason, the dullest year Charlotte Merrow ever kept, which is a thing worth understanding about her trade. For in banking the dull year and the sound year are very often the same year, and the exciting one is nearly always the beginning of a disaster. All that winter and spring and into the summer the town grew rich on the new bank's easy paper. Farmers enclosed and drained and bought stock on it. Tradesmen extended and rebuilt on it. Gentlemen speculated in canal shares and turnpike shares and foreign loans on it, and the county notes went out in a bright, confident flood, 3 and 4 and 5 to the sovereign, and every one of them trusted like coin, because every one of them, so far, was paid in more of the same. And across the square the old bank kept its plain, unfashionable course, took no business it could not answer in gold, made no loan it could not call, put out no note it could not pay, and weighed every morning and every evening the coin in its strong room against the paper in the country. The town thought Miss Merrow had been left behind by the age, and Miss Merrow, who had read a great many histories of a great many banks, and knew that the age in question always ends the same way, went on being left behind with the settled patience of a woman who has seen the tide tables and is content to be the only person on the beach walking inland. She did not keep the counter alone. At her right hand stood old Mr. Hollis, chief clerk of the old bank these 40 years, a spare, dry, upright old man, who had told gold across that oak counter for 2 generations, and could tell a light coin from a true one by the ring of it on the board, before ever it reached the balance. He had taught Charlotte her weights when she was a child on a stool, and he stood now, without ever quite saying so, entirely at her orders, and thought her the soundest banker in Norfolk and her father the second. Between them, morning by morning, they did the plain thing the marble bank across the square had been built expressly to be too grand for. They weighed the money. Charlotte kept the folding balance always at her hand. A small brass coin scale in a worn shagreen case that snapped shut to the size of a snuff box, with 2 little pans and a set of true weights, that had been her grandfather's before it was her father's, and no sovereign, guinea or half went out, or came in across her counter untried, and if a coin would not sit the beam level against its weight, it did not pass. And no man's temper about it moved her a grain, for the balance did not know a squire's coin from a carrier's, and that, she would say, was rather the use of a balance. Because goodwill is the cheapest thing a person of business ever buys, and the dearest to run short of, the old bank did that year a number of small, unprofitable things the marble bank was far too busy prospering to trouble with. When old widow Aldous of the Cadge, who had put by £7 across a hard life of taking in washing, came in frightened by a rumor and asked timidly whether she might have her little all in coin, Charlotte weighed her out 7 gold sovereigns without a flicker, and bid her carry them home and be easy, for the notes and the gold were the same thing at that counter and always would be, and the story of it was round the poor end of the town by nightfall and worth, in the reckoning of the parish, a great deal more than the £7. She kept the counter open late on rent days, when the poor of 3 parishes came to turn a note into bread, and paid the smallest holder as civilly as the greatest, and the town, which laughed at her hoard by day, formed underneath its laughter the slow, immovable conviction of the small depositor, which is the only capital in banking that compounds in the dark, that whatever befell, the Merrow counter would pay. And when the curate of Fenbridge preached one Sunday upon the text out of the Proverbs, that a false balance is an abomination, but a just weight is a delight, and spoke of the folly of trusting the fair outside of a whited thing, and spared nobody's blushes in the application of it. The Baron of Harcombe was in his pew at the head of the aisle, and was observed to sit through the passage with the perfect stillness of a man declining, to notice that a sermon has been weighed out to his exact measure and left, with the compliments of Providence, in his own pew. It was in the high summer of that prospering year that the new gold came down to the country in quantity. The bright new minted full-weight sovereigns, fresh from the London mint, the honest coin that was to be the anchor of the whole paper age if only the age would consent to keep enough of it, and Charlotte, telling over the first bagful into her strong room, weighed each one as her habit was, and came upon one that sat the beam so exactly, so perfectly dead level against its weight. That old Hollis, watching, said it was as true a coin as he had handled in 40 years, and she should keep it by for a pattern. And she did. She dropped that one true sovereign into the little pocket of the shagreen case beside the balance, and kept it, and if, on certain evenings that year, having balanced the day's books and locked the strong room, she took the small bright thing out and turned it over in her fingers rather longer than the settling of an account strictly requires, feeling the milled edge and the honest weight of the one plain thing in all the county that was worth exactly and only what it said it was, she had at least the satisfaction of knowing that nobody saw her do it. It was the great money fright of that December that turned the county's laughter sour in its mouth, and Mr. Craik along with it. It came on suddenly, as such things do, and out of London, where it always begins, a great and famous house in the city, thought as safe as the throne, stopped payment one grey morning over some matter of speculation gone wrong, and a second followed it by the afternoon, and the alarm ran out of the city and into the country along the new fast roads like fire along dry stubble, faster than any reasoning could follow, until in a week there was hardly a market town in England where the people were not queuing at the banks. And the thing they were queuing for was the one thing the whole ingenious paper age had been built on the faith that they would never all want at once. They wanted gold. Not more notes. Gold, the coin itself, in the hand, that a note is only a promise of, for it is the melancholy nature of trust that it is given by inches over years and taken back all in a morning. And a man who has taken paper cheerfully for a decade will, on the day his neighbor looks grave, want metal for it before noon, and want it though the heavens fall. Up and down the county the notes came home to the counters in a flood, no longer money but so many written demands for money, all presented at once, and the banks that had put out 4 notes, and 5 to the sovereign. On the modern faith that the reckoning would never be called, found the reckoning called on every counter in England on the same dreadful week. The marble bank did not last the week. It lasted, in fact, 3 days. On the first, Mr. Craik paid the early comers in gold, with a fine show of ease, and sent urgently to London for more. On the second, London having troubles of its own and no gold to spare for Norfolk, he began paying in silver, and slowly, and with much reading of each note as though a flaw in it might be found. And the queue under the white pillars grew, and stopped laughing and began, very quietly, to be afraid, and on the third morning the tall doors of the county bank did not open. A clerk came out between the pillars and pinned up a paper that the bank had been compelled, by the general and unprecedented distrust, to suspend its payments for a time, and confidently expected, when the present unreasoning alarm should pass, to meet every just claim upon it in full, and went in again, and barred the doors. And the paper under the pillars said, in the long careful words that such papers are always written in, the one short thing that no careful words have ever yet disguised from a man with a note in his hand, that the Grand Bank could not pay. The crowd stood a while in the cold and read it, gentlefolk and farmers and tradesmen who had carried their money across the square from the plain oak counter to the marble one in the settled certainty that pillars were safety. And then it turned, the whole of it, without any word being given, and crossed the square the other way. For across the square the plain oak counter of the old Bank of Merrow's was open, as it was every day it was lawful to be, and behind it Charlotte Merrow was paying. She and old Hollis had opened the strong room at first light and set the gold up in weighed rolls along the counter, and she had put on, over her plain blue gown, the composure of a woman who has spent a year making very sure that this exact morning would find her ready, and had then simply gone to work. She paid every note laid before her in gold across the counter, calmly, without a flicker, weighing out sovereigns to the great subscriber who had laughed at her hoard, and to the washerwoman who had trusted it with the same unhurried exactness. And when a frightened man demanded to know, with the rudeness of fear, whether the money was really there, she answered without looking up from the scale that it was there, that it was the one thing in Fenbridge that morning exactly where it was said to be, and that if he would wait his turn he should have every shilling, and carry it home in his hat if he liked. Word of an open counter runs in a panic faster even than word of a shut one. And all that day and the next, the whole distracted money of the county funneled across the square to the one door in Fenbridge that stood open and paid, and the old bank took in more paper and paid out more gold in 2 days than it had passed in the 2 years before, and never once, from first light to the last bolt, checked or stinted, or paid a man in anything but the full bright weighed coin it had promised him, in a plain notice, in a window, that the whole county had thought, that summer, so very quaint. Now the Baron of Harcombe had cause in that very week to want gold himself, and in a hurry a call had fallen due that a man of honor could not let stand. A matter with a London house that must be met in coin by a named day, or leave a stain no acreage would wash out, and his own bank was shut, his fortune locked in it, and in land no man in England would buy that month, and the notes in his own pocketbook were his own bank's paper and worth, that week, rather less than the leather that held them. He had put great faith over the years in credit and the beautiful reasoning of the prospectus, and he came that hard gray afternoon to the plain fact that governs all figures in the end, that a promise cannot pay a promise, and at the bottom of the whole tower of paper there must be gold or there must be ruin, and the ground does not read prospectuses. He had by him a parcel of good Merrow notes, taken in with his last quarter's rents, and the Baron, who had never in his life stood in a queue for anything, was brought at last, cold and pressed and very nearly out of time, to cross the square to the plain oak counter, and stand in the line of carriers and washerwomen and frightened tradesmen, and ask the woman he had told to keep to her needlework whether she would be so good as to give him gold. He came to her counter in the last hour of the short day, and it was Charlotte herself who was there, in her plain blue gown, with a shawl against the strong room cold, and the folding balance open at her hand, weighing out the day's last coin, and whatever the Baron had prepared to say on the walk over, the sight of the old bank at work took clean out of his mouth. It was not that it was grand, it was that everything in it was reasoned. The gold stood up in weighed rolls where the marble bank had stood empty. The notes came in and were paid without a tremor. The strong room door stood quietly open behind her, because there was no reason on earth to shut it, and the whole plain place hung together, in the failing light, like a set of books that came out right at the foot of every column, which was the more bitter to him, because he had spent a ruinous week learning exactly what a column looks like that does not. Here, behind a weather-worn oak counter, was the one thing his whole modern science had taught him to despise, keeping the one open door in the county open on the worst morning in a generation by the simple, unanswerable expedient of having the money it had promised. He laid his parcel of her notes upon the counter without a word, and she took them up and counted them, and reached for the gold. "You will want it weighed, my lord, or you will want it quick," said Charlotte, not unkindly. "You cannot in reason have both this afternoon, and I think you want it quick." She told him out his gold in full bright sovereigns, every one of them the coin he had called idle money, and gave him the whole face of his notes without the abatement of a farthing, exactly as the plain notice in her window had promised any holder, and not a grain less, though the whole county knew what his need was worth that week, and a harder keeper of a rival's principal might have found a dozen honest reasons to pay him slow. And then, because she was not a woman who would let even the Baron of Harcombe walk out into worse weather with his eyes shut, she did a further thing. She put the last sovereign into his hand with her own bare fingers, which was, though neither of them remarked it then or ever, the first thing that had ever passed directly between their two hands, and she said, in the level voice she used for stating a balance, "You will read on your own pillars, my lord, that your bank was overthrown by an unreasoning alarm. Do not believe it. It will cost you the truth, and the truth is the only thing that will mend it. The alarm was reasoning itself. Your house did not fail because the town lost its nerve. It failed because it had put out 4 notes and 5 for every sovereign it kept, and the town at last asked for the sovereigns. If you would know who emptied your strong room, my lord, do not blame the nerves of your neighbors. Go home and weigh your own reserve against your own issue, in your own hand, before any man does it for you. It is a hard sum, but it is an honest one, and it is the only ground you have left to stand on. 6 is your change. I have given you the good 6. The Baron of Harcombe looked at her for what was, for him, a long moment, and then he did a thing he had not done to her, or perhaps to anybody. In a year he took off his hat to her across the counter. I believe, Miss Merrow, he said, that I have banked upon the wrong front. And he went out with his gold into the cold, and met his call in London by the named day with 24 hours to spare, and it was noticed by old Hollis, who noticed everything and said almost none of it, that his lordship stood a moment on the step outside, with the little roll of sovereigns in his hand, and his eyes on the middle distance, weighing it, like a man who has carried home the answer to a long sum, and is being very careful, this time, not to spill it. After that week, the thing became a public reckoning, in the one way that could not be undone, for what saves a bank's good name, in the end, is not a prospectus but a record, and the record was the counters. When the first blind terror had spent itself, the great surviving houses of the city set themselves to decide which of the country banks were worth the gold it would take to prop them, and which were past propping, and a great London house that meant to send relief into Norfolk sent down before it a confidential man to weigh the ground. A Mr. Marsden, a dry, spare, incorruptible person of 60, whose whole business was to walk into a bank in a bad week and find out, past all its talk and all its marble, exactly what it could pay, and who knew a lord's bank from a shopkeeper's not at all, weighing them both by the same weights. He went first to the great name, and behind the barred doors of the county bank he found what he had found in 100 failed houses before it, a splendid front, beautiful books, and a strong room in which the gold stood to the note issue as a saucer of water stands to a mill pond. Then he crossed the square to the plain oak counter, expecting a second ruin, and stayed 2 hours, and went through the whole issue and reserve with Miss Merrow and old Hollis, coin by coin, and came out of it with his hat in his hand. For the little old bank had answered the same hard standard with gold to spare, more coin in the strong room than paper in the country, a house that had never in the fright borrowed a shilling nor stinted a customer, and needed, of all the banks in Norfolk, no relief whatever, being the one that had brought its own. Mr. Marsden did with this discovery exactly what such a man does, which is to believe the weights and nothing else, and write it down plain. He reported the old Bank of Merrow's the soundest house between the Wash and the sea, needing no support and deserving every confidence. And the great house acted on his report and let it be known through all its correspondence that Merrow's paper was to be taken anywhere, at par, as good as gold, which the county now grasped with the clarity of people who have just watched the alternative shut its doors. It demonstrably was. And the money of the county moved, as money moves, all one way and all at once, back across the square from the marble to the oak. And the story was over every dinner table by the new year, no longer the comedy of the Merrow girl and her spinster's hoard, but in its second and far more durable form, the form that stings. Harcombe called her gold idle money, and would have bought her out and closed her, and told her to keep to her needlework. And she kept the one open bank in the county through the worst fright in living memory, and paid every note in gold when his own marble house could not find the coin to open its doors, and drove home, so to speak, and said not one word about any of it. It is one thing to be laughed at for a bad speculation. It is another, and a far worse one to a man of the Baron's composition, to be shown up before the whole county as the man who called a sound house idle and floated a hollow one on his own name. He sat through those first weeks of the new year with the sensation, wholly new to him, of a man who feels a single thread given a coat he had believed sound, and begins to understand that the whole garment may be strained. For if the little old bank had never in truth been the timid folly he called it, then the question was no longer what Miss Merrow had made of her caution, but what else had been mis-reckoned and mis-reported in his name all these prospering months, while he believed himself the clever one. And below that lay a worse question yet, why a banker's daughter with the ink still on her fingers had paid him his own gold at par, and handed him the plain truth of his ruin across her counter on the day his own house shut, when he had set her down before the whole neighborhood, and what, precisely, it was that he had said to her in return. He went home to Harcombe Court and sent for the bank's books, and there he did the wrong thing first, as even careful men will when the sting is fresh, and it is greatly to the credit of the story that he did, because it was the making of all that came after. He did not, that first raw fortnight, suspect his own manager. The habit of trusting his own concern was the very thing that had ruined him. And it does not break in a night. He suspected the woman who had shown him up. And Mr. Crake, scenting the direction the wind had turned, and cornered by a strong room whose emptiness had begun to want explaining to a master newly grown curious, helped him to it, with the poisonous, respectful, entirely factual art of the frightened underling begging leave to observe that Miss Merrow's reserve had stood very convenient full at the one moment in 10 years it was wanted. That no honest bank keeps gold past its whole issue, so the coin must have been got secretly, borrowed of some London house to make a show and break a rival, that her father held the carrying and corn factoring of half the county in one hand and the bank in the other, so she could have gathered the country's loose coin for months beforehand, and that it was a strange thing, was it not, my lord, that the one dowdy little bank which had nailed up a notice about gold in the summer should have been so exactly ready for the fright in the winter, as though a merely prudent woman could have known the very week London would break, unless she had had some hand in the frightening. It was untrue in everything but its facts, which is the most serviceable kind of untruth there is. And the Baron, this must be set down plainly, because his biographer in these pages has grown fond of him, and fondness is no license for a false account. The Baron gave it harbor. Not belief, harbor. It offered him the one thing he had wanted since the marble doors shut, a version of the winter in which he had not been careless and out-reasoned in his own bank, but merely outmaneuvered by a sharper and less scrupulous hand, a version in which the banker's daughter had not simply kept the gold he was too modern to keep, but had cheated somehow, cooked her figures, borrowed her show, perhaps even whispered up the very panic that broke him. A careful man shown up before the whole county will pay almost any price for such a version. And the price the Baron paid was this. At the meeting called in the new year to settle the wreck of the county bank, where Miss Merrow attended now as a holder of its notes in her own right, and as the one banker in the county whose word on money the room would take, he had her asked to remain when the lesser business was done. And he stood at the head of the long table, with Crake's insinuations squared in his mind if not yet on paper, and after the civilities, which were exact he said in the level administrative voice in which he had once disposed of her caution, because it was still, God help him, the only voice he had been taught for the moments that counted. Before we come to the figures, Miss Merrow, a question of business. Your reserve stood very full at the one moment in 10 years the county had need of it. Fuller, I am given to understand, than any house keeps by ordinary banking. Your father holds the carrying and the corn dealing of half the county in one hand and this bank in the other, and it has been represented to me that a great part of the coin you paid out so freely in the fright was coin gathered to yourself beforehand, or borrowed secretly of London upon terms you have not published, to make a show and to break a rival. I should be glad to know whether the old bank truly held what your books say it held, or whether a strong room in the right hands will always weigh handsome, when the hand that keeps the gold and the hand that counts the notes are the same. There was a silence of the particular kind that Charlotte Merrow had spent her whole-grown life being too sensible to make. And then she did not make it any longer. She opened her work-bag and laid out upon the long table, in a squared row, setting each item straight with a single fingertip, the whole of her answer. The reserve book, kept in her own hand and countersigned by old Hollis, the gold told into the strong room day by day across 2 years. The note issue register beside it, every note the house had ever put out, by number and date, so that any man might reckon the whole paper of the bank to the last pound and set it against the coin. Hollis's counter-book of weights, with the light coins marked and struck. A great fan sheaf of the bank's own cancelled notes, come home through the panic and paid. Each one pierced and marked as paid in gold in that dreadful week, the plainest unbought testimony in the kingdom that the house had done the one thing a bank exists to do. And last, folded once, Mr. Marsden's own weighing, the cold London commissioner's certificate that the reserve stood past the whole issue. And beside the papers she set down 2 small things from the bottom of the bag, the little folding brass balance in its worn case, snapped open, and a single bright sovereign, tipped into the near pan, that sat the beam dead level while the room watched. Strike out every coin you doubt, my lord, with your own hand, weigh the rest yourself, on that balance, against the register, she said. The gold is there, and it is more than the whole paper of this house, and it did not come from cheating. It came from declining. For 6 years, and at a loss you all thought me a fool to bear, the very profit you were floated to make. The 4th note, and the 5th that I would not print, kept back in gold in a drawer you called idle. The coin was not gathered and not borrowed, it was saved, a sovereign at a time, by not spending it, the one way of getting gold your prospectus never mentioned, there being no commission in it. And the fright was not conjured. I read the arithmetic any man at this table might have read, and got ready, which no man at this table troubled to do. You ask whether the hand that keeps the strong room and the hand that counts the notes being the same must mean a false count. It need not, but it did in this county, my lord, and you know now in whose house, for that is the very thing your own manager has done to you these 2 years. From both hands at once, kept your gold and counted your notes and drawn your reports and steered your board, all of it, alone, with no man set to weigh him. It has been found out, not because I am clever, but because gold cannot be talked into a strong room. It is the one trade on earth in which the truth must, in the end, be weighed by somebody in an honest pan. She left the row squared on the table, which was its own sentence. Your notes will be paid at my counter in gold on the days named. My quarrel takes no offense. But I am not at leisure to widen our dealings, my lord, and I will tell you why. It is not the suspicion. Suspicion is weather, and I have kept a counter through worse. It is that you called my house idle without ever weighing it, let your manager keep it and count it and report it without once weighing him, and believed his whisper against me, without opening the books under your own hand the whole time. I have been the honest keeper of one careless gentleman's money already this year, and paid him his own gold at par on the day it was hard to get. And I have no ambition whatever to be told I am the thief of it as well. Good evening. She drew the line under the column, for the second time in this history, and it was ruled as straight as the first. Then she was gone, and the Baron of Harcombe stood alone at the head of the long table, with a squared row of reserve books and cancelled notes, and a little brass balance laid down before him, like a hand turned face up, one bright sovereign sitting level in the pan, and his manager's clever whisper curling somewhere in his mind. Already going the color of a thing that has been believed too long in the dark and brought out at last into the day. There are men who, so answered, summon their dignity, which is to say their servants, and have the papers swept up and the matter closed. What the Baron of Harcombe did instead was the thing that saved him. And it is the reason this story consents to end as it does. He sat down at the table she had left and read every sheet in the row, and took up the little balance she had not troubled to carry away, and weighed the bright sovereign against its weight with his own hand, and it sat level, and he struck out nothing, wheel by wheel or coin by coin, because there was nothing false in it to strike. And the reserve of the little bank stood up honest and whole out of the page when he had done, and told him in his own weighing what her voice had. And then he sent, not for his dignity, but for old Mr. Dunmow, the county bank's aged and honest clerk, whom Craik had kept these 2 years as far from the real reckoning as could be contrived. A man who had begged leave 3 times to speak to his lordship about the issue, and been 3 times turned smoothly away, and for the whole of the manager's books, the note ledgers and the reserve accounts and the loan registers, back to the founding of the concern. For 11 days, while the wreck of the county bank was cried over the county and the lawyers gathered, his lordship conducted upon his own bank the audit he had been so very ready to conduct upon a woman who owed him nothing. He did the thing he had built a whole modern philosophy to avoid. He weighed his own reserve against his own issue, in his own hand, in the cold of his own strong room, with a candle and a borrowed balance, and old Dunmow reading him the register aloud. And the sum came up short against the truth, the way a saucer comes up short against a mill pond. He found the notes put out not 3 to the sovereign nor 4, but in the last speculating year above 6, he found that the half of the gold Craik's reports had sworn to was no gold at all, but the manager's own paper and memoranda, entered as coin by the man who had taken the coin, and he traced the deposits the town had trusted lent long and lent deep to the very canal and enclosure. Speculations Craik had a private finger in, so that the reserve that should have answered the notes had been walking about the county 2 years in Mr. Craik's own schemes. He drove at the last to the addresses in the loan book he had signed and never visited, saw the drained fen and the unbegun canal and the empty warehouse his depositor's gold had become, and read the whole quiet machinery of the ruin. And the accounts came up, at the foot of the 11th night, ruled by his own exact hand into 2 columns that said what columns always say, without manners and without mercy, that the county bank had never once been the sound house he floated it as, that it had been got up on subscribed capital that was never paid. Run on notes it could never answer, its reserve reported full and kept empty, its deposits speculated away year on year by the servant he trusted and did not weigh, so that the money of a whole trusting county had gone quietly these 2 years into one man's ventures, while the bank itself was reported into prosperity to cover the taking. The rot was his own house's, and the one person in the county who had kept honest gold against honest paper, and paid him his own coin at par, and told him so to his face, had been repaid, for her honesty, with the accusation of the precise crime his own manager was that moment being convicted of in the Baron's own writing. Mr. Crake's connection with the bank was ended by the next morning, with a reckoning exact to the shilling of what he had cost it, and a plain intimation that a prosecution waited only upon his lordship's pleasure. And the manager, who could count as well as the next frightened man, took his character and his silence, and was gone out of the county within the week. And a good deal of the town's lost money went into the law after him, and got back what the law ever gets back, which is the satisfaction and not the sum. But the Baron did not, as a smaller man would have, let the wreck lie a wreck. He pledged his own unencumbered land, what the fright had left him of it, against the notes of his broken bank, and gave out plainly that no holder of a county note should lose by his name if the selling of Harcombe acres could prevent it, which cost him the half of his fortune and the whole of his consequence, and bought him the only thing he found, that hard winter he had come to want, the right to look the county, and one banker in it, in the face. And on the evening after that, at Harcombe Court over the walnuts, the Baron sat late with his aunt, Lady Adela, who had contrived to be staying in the house within a day of hearing how the meeting had ended. Her methods, as has been said, were never explained, and never needed to be, and who mercifully waited until the servants were gone before she began. Well, Marcus, you have turned off the man who told you what you wished to hear, which is the first sensible extravagance of your proprietorship. Now what do you propose to do about the young woman who told you what you did not? I imagine, aunt, said the Baron, that you have the answer already drawn. I have had it drawn since the opening, but you could not have signed it then. You were too pleased with yourself. You took such comfort in being right upon paper, Marcus, that you never once opened your own strong room to find out whether the paper was right about the gold. That young woman has never yet told you a single thing you wished to hear, and men of your rank pay fortunes to be flattered. You were handed a true reckoning, free, at your own opening, by a person who had weighed the goods, and you told her to take it to the sewing circle. She cracked a walnut in her own hand, and leveled the pick at him in a manner 3 counties would have recognized. I have kept my money in banks for 50 years, and buried the men who ran most of them. And I will tell you the whole of what I know. There are 2 kinds of bank. The kind you trust because the front is handsome, and the kind you have seen pay gold across the counter on the worst morning of the year, and know will hold. The first will serve you in the fair weather. It is the second you want under you in the fright. And it is the same, exactly the same, with a wife. She will not come to you. She has walked out on you once, and she is the walking out kind, which you may thank Providence on your knees, is the only kind worth the following. And you cannot buy her back. You offered once to buy her whole bank and close it, and she has answered your one insult already with a squared row of the county's own cancelled notes left lying on your table. So there is nothing left to you but the one piece of business you have never in your life transacted with any living soul, to go down to that plain oak counter, on her ground, with no rank in your voice and no settlement in your pocket, and be weighed against her, and treat. The Baron was quiet a long moment, turning his glass by the stem, with the look. She recorded it with satisfaction for 20 years, of a man pulling the last figure of a long sum and finding, this time, that it held. You are mistaken in one particular, aunt, he said at last. I did notice, at the opening, when she gave me the 6 sentences, and never raised her voice. I noticed, and it was inconvenient, and I entered it, and passed on. That is what I have instead of blindness, madam, a filing system. It is the worst fault. A blind man cannot help what he fails to see. No, said Lady Adela comfortably, but a filing man can go back and open the drawer. Go down to the counting house, Marcus. You have a broken bank to wind up honestly, and a county's confidence to earn back a shilling at a time. And she is the only person between here and London who knows how it is done, and the only one whose name on the winding up would make the town believe it, and every last one of your excuses for calling upon her, I am delighted to say, is entirely commercial. He came to the counting house in February, on a plain winding-up errand that he had, for the first time in his life, arranged to have no other business behind, and he was kept waiting 20 minutes in the small inner room where the Merrows did their accounts, under a framed and faded first note of the house from 40 years before, and a long file of the day's ledgers, with his hat on his knee and the strong room door plain in the wall beside him, while a carrier's small deposit was finished beyond the door. Because Charlotte Merrow was not a woman who would abridge one man's business for another man's rank. What he thought while he waited he never afterward told anybody, but when Charlotte came in at last, with the ink still on her fingers and the carrier's receipt in her hand, he stood, and did not begin with the weather. Miss Merrow, at the opening, unasked and for nothing, you gave me the 6 soundest sentences ever spoken about a bank of mine, and I told you to take them to the sewing circle. In the fright you paid me my own gold at par across this counter, on the one day in the year it was hard to come by, when a harder keeper of a rival's money might have paid me slow and had my whole errand at ransom, and you handed me, with the coin, the plain truth of my ruin, which no man in my pay would tell me, and I have never yet thanked you for either, which I am here in part to mend. And in the new year I did the worst thing of the 3. I asked you, on a frightened man's whisper, whether your honesty was a conjuring trick, and you answered me with a row of the county's own cancelled notes and a sovereign left weighing level on your balance, and were good enough not to have me put out of the room, which I had earned. I am not come to apologize, or not only. An apology is a coin a gentleman may mint at his own pleasure, and you have taught me a proper suspicion of any payment that costs the payer nothing. I am come to be weighed, and to treat. I want you to wind up the wreck of my bank, and build what should stand in its place, on your own footing, in gold, with what is left of my land behind it and your name upon the door. At what your judgment is worth, and not at what my ruin makes me glad to pay. The accounts of it set open to any holder that asks, yourself the first, for I have weighed my own strong room in the dark now, by a candle, and found it empty, and an agreement between us that survives my temper and yours, though I am reliably informed only one of us is troubled with the article. And, this with the smallest pause, no longer than a balance takes to settle, I am instructed by my aunt, and by a conviction that arrived, as all my convictions do, some months after the invoice, that I am to say the whole of it plainly and on your own ground, and this is your ground, so I will add the last item to the schedule, and you may strike it out without prejudice to the rest. I do not want my consequence back, nor my marble. I want the woman who kept the gold. Not rescued. You are the least rescuable person in this county. Wanted, as a man wants the one partner whose reserve is always the equal of her word, when his own has just been proved, in his own hand a hollow show. And if that is not a lover's language, it is at least the only one in which I have never once managed to tell you a lie. There was a silence in the small counting house, and it is recorded that Miss Charlotte Merrow, who had answered a baron's insult within the week and a baron's insinuation within 2 minutes, looked at the last item on this schedule a long moment, and then said, in a voice her father through the wall did not recognize, being softer than the voice she weighed gold in, "You will understand, my lord, that I do not pass a coin on a single weighing." And then, the composure coming back like a beam settling to the level, the winding up, and the open accounts, and the agreement between us we may draw fair today. Mr. Ferris is across the street, and can be fetched by 4. The last item stands over. It is not struck out, my lord. It is only not yet past, and I have a rule that I learned young and have never had cause to regret, that I try a coin in the balance before I will warrant it will pass. You will keep this counter with me, if you please, through the next bad week there is, not in the fair weather, my lord. I have had my fill of gentlemen who will admire a bank in the sunshine, and we will see how you weigh a hard morning with a woman who counts every coin. And if you are still of this mind when the last bolt is drawn, you may call again. When there is no other business whatever on the table between us, none at all, so that neither of us may ever pretend afterward that the accounts were mixed. That, said the Baron of Harcombe, is the first ruling you have handed down all winter that has fallen in my favor. And he stayed, and drew the agreements fair with Mr. Ferris by candlelight, and the Merrow's clerk dined out on the story of that afternoon for 11 years. The public reckoning, for in a county everything must be reckoned publicly, sooner or later, or it does not count, came at the great meeting of the creditors of the county bank, held in the assembly room of the town, before the assembled magistrates and merchants and gentlemen, and half the anxious depositors of 300s. Where the scheme for winding up the wreck and paying the holders in full over 3 years, drawn by Miss Merrow and backed by the Baron's pledged acres, came to be laid before the county for its consent. There had been ugly talk all winter, the greater part of it Sir Gregory Pell's, who had lost a comfortable sum in the marble bank, and needed, as such men do, somebody other than himself to have been fooled by, and Sir Gregory, who did not scruple to owe the meeting a grievance for a purse, was heard to wonder aloud whether the county ought in prudence to place its whole confidence, and the drawing of so weighty a scheme, in the hands of a house kept these dozen years under a lady's apron, gentlemen. I mean nothing by it. Whatever cold persons from London may have been persuaded to weigh, and whatever tricks of hoarding may look like wisdom after the event, it was the Baron of Harcombe who rose. He rose in the deliberate way he did everything, and the room went quiet, for the county had waited all winter to hear what his lordship would find to say upon the whole affair, and the county knew the settling of an account when it saw one get to its feet. The meeting has heard Sir Gregory, he said. I have a declaration to make, and I will make the whole of it, because it has been making itself in my books all winter, and I had rather speak it plainly than have it whispered. Some 15 months ago I put my name and my fortune to the head of the county bank, and I called the reserve of the old Bank of Merrow's idle money in the hearing of the lady who kept it, and I would have bought her house and closed it. And I told her to carry her judgment to the sewing circle. The county has enjoyed the comparison ever since. This winter, in the fright, my own bank that I had trusted upon my manager's word could not find the gold to open its doors and shut them in the town's face, and the old bank, that the same fashion taught us all to call a timid folly, kept its counter open through the whole panic, and paid every note it had ever issued in gold, and was weighed and found sound by the coldest house in London besides. And I have since weighed my own bank myself, in my own strong room, in the dark, and found, in my own writing, that it was never sound at all, but a fair front over an empty room, overissued, its reserve reported full, and kept empty, its deposits speculated away for years by the servant I trusted, and never once weighed. There is no petticoat banking on that oak counter, gentlemen, there is banking. Of a soundness I have examined at my own cost and to my own shame, and whoever taught this county to trust a bank for its marble, and to laugh at a reserve it had not weighed, taught it at my expense. The lesson is paid for in full, out of my own land and my own consequence, and the meeting may have the good of it for nothing, which is a better price than I got. The meeting gave the winding up into Miss Merrow's hands without a division, and the county, which never apologizes, did the thing counties do instead, and began that very evening to remember that it had always said there was something remarkable in the Merrow girl. And Lady Adela, driving home from the assembly, remarked to her coachman, She had reached the time of life for remarking things to her coachman, that she had watched a great many gentlemen stand up in a county meeting in 50 years and give away money, but only the one stand up and give away the joke against himself, and that the county would find on reflection that the second was much the rarer coin, and her coachman, who had driven her to the doors of every bank in the kingdom, said no doubt her ladyship knew best, and the horses agreed. He kept the counter with her a fortnight after, on as ugly a market morning as the late winter afforded, a local fright of no great weight. A rumor run through the corn country that set the small holders queuing again at every door in the town, and he stood the whole of it at her right hand where old Hollis stood, weighing out gold coin to frightened men, learning the plain unglamorous liturgy of the thing, to pay without haste and without stint, to answer a rude fear civilly, to give the washerwoman her 7 sovereigns as exactly as the squire his 700, and never once, whatever the man across the counter deserved, to let the counter know the difference. He kept, to his own considerable surprise, his temper and his seat and a good deal of his heart on a morning that never once found the strong room short, and he called again. A 12-month to the month from the opening where he had called her gold idle money, when there was no other business on the table, she had seen to that, having closed the last account of the winding up 2 days early, which was the only public sign she ever gave. He came to the counting-house on a soft May evening, when the counter was shut, and the day's gold weighed away, and the strong room locked, and found her there alone by the balance, ruling the last line under the last column of the wound-up bank, and what passed there was brief, because the essential negotiation had been conducted all year, in weighed gold and cancelled notes, and one squared row of the county's own paper, and both parties came, as Charlotte observed, current in their accounts. "I am given to understand," said the Baron, "that you do not take terms from barons." "That has been my policy," Charlotte agreed. "It has served me tolerably, on the whole." "Then I have not brought terms." He stood on the honest side of the plain oak counter, hat in hand, precisely where he had laid down his parcel of her notes on the worst day of the fright. "I have brought a proposal of partnership. The 2 houses to be worked as one, in gold, on an honest issue, and the accounts open forever to any holder that asks, the bank to remain, in law and in fact, entirely and only yours, for so long as you will keep it, name and reserve and counter, because I have learned at last what it costs me not to know which things a man had better not try to buy. Your father to keep his chair by the fire and his weights in his pocket, and to dine at Harcombe every Sunday of his life, and the whole arrangement to run, he considered, as a careful man does before he commits himself to a term of years, in perpetuity, renewable nightly, in all weathers, fair and foul. I am instructed by my aunt that I am also to mention love. I had intended to. It is the whole of the consideration, Miss Merrow. There is nothing else in the instrument. I have weighed it now, in the dark and in the fright, and across your own counter, and it sits level, and it will bear." And Charlotte Merrow, who had weighed every coin of every bargain she ever made before she would warrant it, looked at him a moment across the plain counter with the level attending look he had once declined to meet, and found that, for the first time in her grown life, she had already weighed this bargain, all year, in the worst weather there was, and knew to the grain what it was, and what it would bear. She took the little folding balance from beside her hand, and set it open on the counter between them, and dropped into the near pan the one true sovereign she had carried in its case since the summer he called her reserve idle, the full weight coin that was worth exactly and only what it said it was, and the beam swung once and settled, and sat dead level, and then she gave him her hand across it, ink and gold dust and all. "Then we are agreed in principle, my lord," she said composedly, and what she added, when he had come round the end of the counter and there was no more oak between them at all, old Hollis, who happened just then to be very busy indeed with the shutting of the strong room, has unanimously declined for 40 years to report. They were married in June, at the church under the Market Cross. A year and some months from the October forenoon, he had called her gold idle money, and Sir Gregory Pell danced at the wedding. Because counties are like that, and Lady Adela cried, which she denied, and old Hollis gave the bride's health in a speech of 4 sentences he had plainly written and rewritten for a week. And Josiah Merrow, asked by a Norwich cousin whether it were not a great match for a banker's daughter, answered comfortably that he could not speak for the heralds, but that as a man of business he would say his lordship had bought at the very bottom of a falling market the one sound security in the county, and would never see the price again, and drank to it. The bank kept its name. She would never have it altered, and in time the name altered its own meaning, as names do when the metal behind them is made good. Until Merrow's meant, from the coast to Norwich, and wherever a careful man handled money, the soundest house in the county. The one bank that had paid every note in gold across its counter in the great fright when the marble house shut its doors, and the plain oak counter that had never yet failed a customer of a shilling. The Baroness of Harcombe kept her own books and weighed her own gold to the end of her life, and the ink on her fingers scandalized 3 generations of dinner tables, and her husband, who had once told her that gold in a drawer was idle money, was heard at those same tables. Whenever a scheme or a prospectus or a fine-sounding credit was laid before him, to ask first, always in the family voice his children learned to imitate lovingly behind his back. But is it there in gold this morning? 2 objects outlasted the principals, and are the proper end of this story. In the shallow drawer of her writing desk, folded once, neat as she folded everything, lay the first of the county bank's notes that she had ever paid in gold across her counter in the fright, pierced and marked as paid, with a slip pinned to the back of it in her own hand, recording what old Hollis had said the morning the marble doors stayed shut. That a bank was worth what it paid, and not a farthing more, and that theirs had paid. And on the library mantel at Harcombe Court, between the porcelain and in some defiance of it, lay a plain little folding balance of worn brass, no bigger than a snuff-box, its 2 pans and its true weights bright with handling, and beside it a single gold sovereign, full weight and honest, that a guest had only to drop into the near pan to see the old beam swing once and settle dead level, exactly as it had settled the evening she gave her hand across it, the first true coin that ever weighed level on that balance, kept from the year the county called her gold idle, set there by the Baron himself, who was exact about everything, including this, and when guests asked. And guests always asked, he would take up the sovereign and drop it once into the pan so that they saw the beam sit true, and give them the saying the county had long since worn smooth, and that you may have now for nothing, as she once gave him the 6 sentences at the opening, that a bank, like a reputation, is worth exactly what it can pay across the counter the day the whole town comes asking. And no marble upon the front of it can add a sovereign to that, nor any man's fine talk of credit take a sovereign away. Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.